was a typical Wednesday morning on Skyline Airways flight SL-288 from New York to Los Angeles. The business class cabin buzzed with its usual pre-flight activity as passengers settled into their seats. Among them was James Thompson, a distinguished executive in his mid-50s who had recently acquired a significant stake in the airline and been appointed as its new chief operating officer. Today, he was making an unannounced flight, dressed casually in jeans, a navy blazer, and a red MAGA hat. The sight of his hat caught Karen Mitchell's attention from her seat a few rows behind. As a platinum-level frequent flyer, she felt the hat was inappropriate for the premium cabin. It symbolized everything she was against, and she became increasingly agitated. Unable to let it go, she pressed the call button and demanded that a flight attendant address the situation. What Karen and the crew didn't know was that they were about to make a decision they would regret, one that involved not just any passenger, but the new COO of their entire airline. Before we dive into this dramatic story of mistaken identity, power dynamics, and valuable lessons about prejudice in the service industry, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced unfair treatment during a flight? Has someone ever judged you before, knowing who you really are? It all started when Karen Mitchell's eyes narrowed as she spotted James Thompson's red hat in the business class cabin. For Karen, the hat was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol that made her deeply uncomfortable. For Karen, the sight of the red hat in her carefully curated premium cabin space was more than she could tolerate. Today, however, Karen was determined to test the airline's service standards. She was adamant that something needed to be done about the man in the MAGA hat. "Excuse me," she began, her tone urgent and demanding as Tom Wilson, the flight attendant, responded to her call button. "That man over there," she said, pointing toward James, "his hat is offensive. It's making people uncomfortable. You need to ask him to remove it." Her voice was filled with indignation, and she clearly expected immediate action. Tom followed her gaze and saw James quietly reading through some documents, looking completely at peace. He looked back at Karen, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Ma'am, I don't think wearing a hat violates any of our dress code policies," he said carefully, trying to keep his voice low and professional, hoping to diffuse the tension. But he could already sense that Karen wasn't going to be satisfied with that answer. Karen crossed her arms, her platinum frequent flyer card peeking out of her jacket pocket. Her voice rose slightly as she spoke. "It's not just a hat, it's a political statement, and it's making people like me feel unsafe in this premium cabin. I've flown over 1,000,000 miles with Skyline, and I expect better. You need to do something about it." Her eyes flashed with determination, and it was clear she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Tom sighed warily. He could see this wasn't going to be an easy situation to handle. He didn't want to escalate things, but Karen's insistence in status as a high-tier frequent flyer left him few options. He knew that any misstep could turn into a bigger problem at 35,000 feet. Tom walked down the aisle to where James was sitting, taking a moment to steady himself before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone as respectful as possible. "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to ask if you would mind removing your hat during the flight. We've had some concerns from other passengers," he spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, trying to convey that he was just doing his job. James looked up from his documents, his expression calm but questioning. "Complaints about what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It's just a hat." His voice was even, but there was an edge of disbelief in his tone. He couldn't understand why anyone would be so offended by what he was wearing on a simple cross-country flight. "Some passengers find it offensive, sir," Tom explained, glancing over his shoulder at Karen, who was watching the interaction intently. Tom could feel the pressure building. Karen's eyes were practically boring into his back, and he knew she was waiting for him to take more decisive action. "Just curious," James replied, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Is there something in Skyline's dress code policy about hats or political expression?" He had every right to be on this flight, and he knew it. He wasn't causing any disturbance, and he certainly wasn't breaking any airline regulations that he was aware of. And he was very aware of them all. Tom hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I'm not entirely sure, sir," he admitted, but I've been asked to address the complaint." He could feel the tension building between them and knew that whatever he said next would be crucial. He desperately wanted to avoid any conflict aboard the aircraft. "Well, I'm not going to remove it," James said firmly, his voice carrying a calm authority. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I'd like to see the airline's policy if that's what you're basing this request on." Tom could feel the situation slipping out of his control. He glanced around nervously before reaching for his crew phone to call his supervisor. Within minutes, Lisa Chen, the senior flight attendant, arrived at James's seat. Lisa was known for her strict approach to cabin management, and as she approached, her expression hardened at the sight of James's hat. "What seems to be the problem here, Tom?" Lisa asked, her voice clipped. She could sense from her colleague's uncomfortable stance that things were already getting complicated. These were exactly the kind of situations she disliked handling, but as the senior crew member, it came with the territory. Tom quickly briefed Lisa on the situation, explaining Karen's complaint and James's refusal to comply. Lisa turned her attention to James, her stance becoming more assertive. "Sir, I understand from my colleague that you're refusing to remove your hat," Lisa began, her tone now much firmer than Tom's had been. "We aim to provide a comfortable flying experience for all our premium cabin passengers, and right now your hat is causing distress to others." James met her gaze steadily. "I'm simply exercising my right to wear what I choose," he said calmly. "I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm sitting quietly, following all standard airline protocols. I've flown thousands of times, and this is a first." "All of us," Lisa continued, emphasizing each word, "we're trying to maintain a peaceful cabin environment for everyone." Her tone was becoming increasingly authoritative, and it was clear she was in no mood to negotiate. "I appreciate that," James responded, maintaining his composure, "but I think we all know this isn't about maintaining peace in the cabin. This is about certain passengers not liking what my hat represents. I'd like to speak to your lead flight attendant." Lisa exchanged a look with Tom, her frustration evident. She could see that James wasn't going to back down, and she knew this situation was quickly becoming more than she was authorized to handle. "Sir, we're going to have to escalate this if you don't comply," she warned, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Then escalate it," James replied evenly. "Let's see what your supervisor has to say about this." His tone remained unwavering, and it was clear he wasn't afraid of any consequences they might threaten. Lisa sighed heavily and reached for her crew phone to call Michelle Parker, the lead flight attendant. The situation was becoming more complicated than she had anticipated, and she knew they needed someone with more authority to handle it. Karen watched the scene unfold from her seat, a smug expression of satisfaction creeping across her face as she saw more crew members getting involved. Other passengers in the business class cabin had begun to take notice, some pretending not to watch, while others openly stared at the developing situation. It wasn't long before Michelle Parker, the lead flight attendant, made her way to James's seat. She had been in the galley preparing for departure when she received Lisa's call, and her irritation at having her pre-flight routine interrupted was evident on her face. As Michelle arrived at James's seat, Karen was quick to intercede. "So, are you the lead flight attendant?" she asked, her voice filled with indignation. Without waiting for confirmation, she continued, "This man is deliberately causing a disturbance. His hat is offensive, and he's refusing to cooperate with your crew." Michelle nodded curtly, her eyes scanning the situation. She turned her attention to James, who was still sitting calmly with his arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. "Sir," Michelle began to speak to James, her tone carrying years of practiced authority, "we've had multiple concerns about your hat. As the lead flight attendant on this aircraft, I need you to either remove it or I'll have to ask you to deplane. We're still at the gate, and we can easily arrange for you to take the next flight." James met her gaze evenly. "I've already explained to your colleagues that I've done nothing wrong," he said. "I'd like to see the specific airline policy that says I can't wear this hat." His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to his words that suggested he wasn't going to back down easily. "We don't need a specific policy, sir," Michelle said, her tone growing colder. "Our job is to ensure this cabin is a safe and welcoming environment for all passengers. If your presence is making others uncomfortable, we have the right to take necessary action." A welcoming environment for all, he repeated thoughtfully. It doesn't seem very welcoming to passengers with different viewpoints. Don't you think it's discriminatory to remove someone based on their political expression? Karen, who had been watching from nearby, couldn't contain herself any longer. She stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. You're just here to cause trouble, she snapped. People like you think you can just push your views on everyone else, and it's not right. Michelle held up her hand, trying to regain control of the situation. Enough, she said sharply. She turned back to James. Sir, I'm asking you one last time. Either remove the hat or we'll have you removed from this flight. James took a deep breath, his eyes locking with Michelle's. I've done nothing wrong, Kerpong, he repeated calmly. But if you're determined to remove me from this flight, go ahead and call ground security. Just know that you're making a serious mistake, Miss Parker. Michelle's eyes narrowed at his words. Is that a threat? She asked, her voice tinged with irritation. She was used to dealing with difficult passengers, but there was something about James's demeanor that unsettled her. It's not a threat, James replied evenly. It's just a fact. I think you're going to regret the way you have handled this situation. Michelle shook her head dismissively and reached for her radio. This is Lead F.A. Parker, she spoke into the device. I need a gate agent and ground security to business class, seat 4A. We have a passenger who needs to be deplaned. James nodded slowly, gathering his belongings with deliberate calm. Remember what I said, he spoke quietly but firmly as he stood. You'll regret this decision. As he slowly placed his laptop in his bag, Michelle gestured for Tom and Lisa to stand ready. 2 gate agents and a ground security officer had already arrived at the cabin door. Come on, sir, one of the gate agents said tentatively. Let's handle this at the gate. There was something about James's composure that made them all slightly uneasy. Difficult passengers usually didn't maintain such calm confidence while being removed. Karen watched with her arms crossed, a smirk of satisfaction on her face as James was escorted toward the door. Other business class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some filming discreetly with their phones, others pretending to be absorbed in their magazines. This is ridiculous, James commented as he walked down the aisle, his voice carrying just enough for the cabin to hear. A premium airline removing a passenger over a hat. Interesting business decision. His words held a weight that none of them yet understood. Michelle followed behind, keeping her professional demeanor, but unable to shake a creeping sense of unease. Something about his parting words and calm demeanor didn't sit right with her, but she pushed the thought aside. After all, she was the lead flight attendant, and she had made her decision. As James reached the jet bridge, he turned one last time to face Michelle. I'll be having a word with corporate about this, he said, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. Good luck with the rest of your flight. The gate agents exchanged nervous glances. They'd heard passengers make similar threats before, but something about this felt different. James's composure and the quiet authority in his voice suggested this wasn't an empty threat. As James walked away, Michelle returned to the cabin, where Karen was already telling nearby passengers how she'd helped maintain the standards of business class. But despite her outward confidence, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. You'll regret this decision, his words kept echoing in her mind. What none of them knew was that their next shift briefing would be very different from any they'd ever attended before, and that this incident would reshape the airline's entire approach to customer service. The next morning, Michelle Parker and her crew arrived at JFK's crew briefing room for what they thought would be a routine pre-flight meeting. Instead, they found Robert Anderson, the airline's vice president of human resources, waiting for them. His stern expression immediately set off alarm bells. Thank you all for coming in early, Robert began, his voice measured and controlled as he glanced at the flight attendants, his gaze lingering on Michelle. We have a serious situation to discuss regarding an incident that occurred on yesterday's flight SL-288. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Tom and Lisa exchanged uneasy glances. The tension in the room was palpable. Robert took a deep breath before continuing. The passenger you removed from the aircraft yesterday was not just any business class traveler. That man was James Thompson, our newly appointed chief operating officer, who had just acquired a significant stake in Skyline Airways. The silence that followed was deafening. Michelle felt her heart sink into her stomach. her face flushing with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Lisa's eyes widened, and Tom's jaw dropped slightly, his worst fears confirmed. David's gaze remained fixed on Michelle as he continued. Mr. Thompson contacted me immediately after the incident. He was conducting an unannounced service evaluation flight, only to be discriminated against and removed from our aircraft simply for wearing a hat. This kind of behavior is not only unprofessional, it's completely unacceptable for any airline that values customer service. Michelle found her voice, though it trembled slightly. I didn't know who he was, she stammered, searching for an excuse. If I had known, Robert raised his hand, cutting her off. It doesn't matter if he was the COO or any other passenger, he said firmly. Every customer should be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or personal beliefs. That is the standard we hold ourselves to. And that is what Mr. Thompson expects from his airline. Tom and Lisa sat in silence, both realizing the magnitude of their mistake. They had followed Michelle's lead, but now it was clear that those actions had been terribly misguided. Robert turned his attention back to Michelle, his expression grave. Michelle, as lead flight attendant, you're expected to set an example for our crew. Your handling of yesterday's situation demonstrated poor judgment and a complete failure of leadership. Instead of de-escalating the situation, you allowed personal bias to dictate your actions. This has left us with no choice. Michelle's eyes widened, her face went pale. She knew what was coming, but still wasn't ready to hear it. The reality of the situation sank in. She had lost her job, her 15 years of seniority, gone in an instant. Robert didn't wait for a response. He turned to Tom and Lisa, his expression softening slightly. As for you two, Mr. Thompson recognizes that you were following your lead's orders. While this doesn't excuse your actions, it does mitigate them. You will both be required to undergo extensive customer service training and sensitivity coaching. Consider this your final warning. Any future incidents of this nature will result in immediate termination. Tom and Lisa both nodded quickly, relief mixing with shame on their faces. Thank you, Mr. Anderson, Lisa whispered, her usual confidence notably absent. Robert stood up, commanding the room's attention once more. Mr. Thompson has made it clear that this incident requires more than just disciplinary action. Over the next month, we will be implementing comprehensive changes across Skyline Airways. First, we're introducing a new passenger respect policy. Every customer, regardless of their beliefs, appearance, or political views, deserves equal treatment in premium service. This policy will be prominently displayed at every gate and in all our training materials. Second, all flight crews will undergo mandatory bias recognition and service equality training. We're bringing in external consultants to develop this program. Third, we're establishing a clear escalation protocol for passenger complaints. No passenger should ever be removed from an aircraft without proper cause and thorough evaluation. Finally, we're revising our customer feedback system to better track and address any instances of discriminatory treatment. Robert paused, letting his words sink in. This incident has exposed a serious flaw in our service culture. Mr. Thompson expects Skyline Airways to set the industry standard for professional, unbiased customer service. These changes are just the beginning. He then introduced Emily Davis, who would be taking over as the new lead flight attendant. Emily will be implementing these new policies and helping to rebuild our service culture. She has Mr. Thompson's full confidence. As the meeting concluded, Robert's final words resonated through the room. Let this be a lesson to all of us. In the service industry, we check our personal biases at the door. Our job is to serve all passengers equally, regardless of their political beliefs or personal expression. Mr. Thompson expects nothing less from his airline. 1 month after the incident, James Thompson decided it was time to evaluate the changes at Skyline Airways. This time, he boarded Flight SL-288, wearing the same red MAGA hat, but the response couldn't have been more different. As he entered the business class cabin, he immediately noticed a change in atmosphere. The new passenger respect policy, was prominently displayed at the boarding door, and the crew's demeanor was noticeably more professional and welcoming. Emily Davis, the new lead flight attendant, greeted each passenger with genuine warmth, regardless of their appearance or attire. James settled into his seat, observing as Tom served pre-flight beverages. Tom's interaction with passengers had transformed. He was more confident, more professional, and notably more consistent in his service approach. The extensive training had clearly made an impact. Mr. Thompson, Emily approached his seat with a warm smile. Welcome aboard. Is there anything you need before takeoff? Her professionalism was exactly what he had envisioned for the airline. Coincidentally, Karen Mitchell was once again on the flight, seated a few rows behind. When she recognized James, her face turned red with embarrassment, quickly burying herself in a magazine to avoid eye contact. The irony wasn't lost on James, but he wasn't interested in making her uncomfortable. He just wanted her and everyone else to learn from what had happened. During the flight, Robert Anderson joined him to discuss the changes. The new training program has been remarkably successful, Robert said. Messenger complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped to zero, and our customer satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. Good, James nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. This isn't just about avoiding incidents like what happened to me. It's about creating a culture where every passenger feels valued, regardless of their beliefs or appearance. As they talked, James noticed how the crew handled various passenger requests with consistent professionalism. There was no more selective service or bias-based treatment, just pure professional courtesy for everyone. Before James left the aircraft in Los Angeles, Emily approached him one final time. Mr. Thompson, thank you for giving us the opportunity to improve. The changes you've implemented have made us better at our jobs and prouder of our airline. James smiled, adjusting his hat slightly. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Remember, in this industry, success isn't just about getting people from point A to point B. It's about how we treat them along the way. As he walked through LAX, James felt a sense of satisfaction. The incident that had started it all was now a valuable lesson in customer service, professional conduct, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their personal beliefs. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced unfair treatment while traveling? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about justice, leadership, and valuable life lessons.